In a classic hit song that has swept this nation for decades, a very important and urgent question is posed. It is a song that can be sung into infinitude, never finding an answer or resolution to the question at hand. This question requires a sophisticated mind to unravel one of life's most philosophical quandaries. It is a question that calls us to confrontation as we interrogate every single person around us, friend and foe alike. The question is, beloved, who stole the cookie from the cookie jar? Yes, you too have been asking this question for decades, never finding an answer. Perhaps you have participated in this investigative sing-along activity as a kid. The song typically begins with a lead investigator asking a group of deviant suspects about some illegal activity involving a missing cookie. Who stole the cookie from the cookie jar? The accuser asked, followed by the name of one of the suspects. Mia stole the cookie from the cookie jar. One by one, each suspect questions and then denies the accusation. Who, me? The suspect asked, inviting confusion. The group and the accuser respond, yes, you. Couldn't be, then who? The call and response sing-along can be infinitely repetitive, with the tendency to go on and on because no one wants to admit that they are in fact the one who stole the cookie from the jar. It's a silly little exercise on the surface that is more about musicality and rhythm than the actual investigative nature of the crime at hand. By the end of the exercise, we're still left wondering who stole the cookie from the jar. There is no acknowledgement of the sin. There is no reparation for the transgression. There is simply the myth of a mystery looming over the heads of everyone in the circle, feeding and encouraging skepticism and provoking disgust among them. Have you ever had your lunch stolen out of the fridge at work? You know, you get there at 9 a.m., you put your lunchbox in the refrigerator, you go back to the kitchen at noon, getting ready to eat your good lunch that you brought from home, and you can't find it. And so you start asking around the office, you start asking your coworkers, hey, did you happen to eat my spaghetti and meatballs? Did you happen to eat my leftovers from Popeyes last night? And what's more frustrating than your lunch being stolen is the fact that you can't find an answer. What's more upsetting is the fact that somebody is lying. You're upset because somebody is not owning up to their transgression. I have to imagine that this is where we meet Esau and the Edomites today. Beloved, I come to speak to you from the topic, repairing the breach, or who stole my cookies? The cookie jar is an elementary version of an age-old blame game, the exercise that we are trained to do to make sense of our misfortunes. When we're late to work, or we slip and fall in a building, or our car runs out of gas on the highway, our first thought is to immediately figure out who is at fault other than us. Have you ever been walking down a street, down a sidewalk, or in a valley somewhere, and you trip and you fall, or you trip over something, and our immediate reaction is not to say, oh, I should have been paying attention and not texting on my phone. Our immediate reaction is to turn around, look at the ground, and get mad at the ground because we tripped over the ground. We're always looking for somebody else to blame, the tree trunk or our coworker or our neighbor, but never ourselves. The cookie jar is an elementary activity, and as with the cookie jar, many of us who have lived lives on the margins, we have lived our lives as the ones missing the cookie, never getting an answer to who stole our stuff, or if we even get an answer, there is never an acknowledgement of the transgression on behalf of the transgressor. There is never an apology and admittance of the deed that devoured our public worth and disenfranchised our communities. Anybody who's ever been evicted because the rents are rising in their gentrifying neighborhoods knows what it's like to ask, who stole my cookie, and never get an answer or apology. If you've ever had your leftovers eaten by a family member who didn't ask permission, you know what it's like to ask, who stole my cookie? If you've ever had money go missing from your purse or unknown charges show up on your credit card, you've probably asked who stole my cookie and never got an answer or an apology. Esau has his cookie stolen from his jar in the 25th chapter of Genesis. Born first to his mother, Rebekah, he came out the womb red, they say, or in Hebrew, the word used is admoni, a play on the word Edom. His descendants would go on to become the Edomites, the people mentioned in the passage from Obadiah today. They say Jacob, his younger brother, came out of the birth canal grabbing onto his heel. It's a bizarre scene, and it's really not written to be about Esau's misfortune. In the end, this is a setup for Jacob's story, for the story of his people, the people who are at the center of what we call our sacred text, the people who are known as the Israelites. Jacob's story pops up in writings around the 7th century before the Common Era, when the Judeans are in exile, but we know it was part of oral tradition long before it was written down. In fact, so much of Jacob's story shares similarities with many other texts, similarities such as the battle between brothers. As in Cain and Abel's story, there is this tension between the brother who is the hunter, Esau, and the brother who is the shepherd, Jacob. As firstborn, Esau is promised to inherit leadership of the family, a double share of the inheritance. This is his birthright. One day, Jacob corners Esau. He corners Esau in a moment of hunger and vulnerability and coaxes him into selling his birthright, selling his inheritance. Esau, presented as dull and impetuous, is outsmarted by his brother on an empty stomach. They say children in school don't learn well on empty stomachs. In fact, the ability to retain pertinent information is nearly impossible if one is experiencing dire hunger or thirst. A lot of impetuous decisions happen when one doesn't have access to basic necessities. Jacob knows something about this and manipulates his older brother so that he can get ahead in life. Like Esau, poor and marginalized Black, brown, and indigenous folks in this country have been painted as lazy and dull, unable to keep up economically and socially, easily duped and manipulated. Thanks to the blossoming of neoliberalism in the 80s, the manipulators would have us believe that it is because of their own doing. It is because of their own shallow-mindedness, their own inability to just pull themselves up by the bootstraps. But we ain't even got no boots, I heard somebody say. Generations after the first Jacob looted the cookie jars of indigenous folks in this country through theft of land. Generations after the first Jacob looted Africans and their descendants through exploitation of labor, Black folk and Latinx folk and indigenous folks find ourselves crying out, who stole our cookies and how do we get them back? Where is my birthright and how do I get it back? I imagine Esau asking the same thing when he finds out that his brother Jacob has not only deceived him, but has deceived their father Isaac as well. The birthright was sold in chapter 25, but it wasn't enough to secure power. Jacob needed Isaac's blessing. The birthright meant nothing without the blessing. Deathbed blessings and curses were important in the lives of ancient peoples. The blessing was believed to release a power that could not be recanted, a tangible power that defined the destiny of the recipient. Not only does Jacob take advantage of Esau, he takes advantage of his visually impaired and aging father by pretending to be Esau so that his father would give him the blessing meant for his brother. And this is the breach. This is the betrayal. It lingers. It spills into the future, into several chapters down the line. It lingers, spilling into the subsequent generations, creating ongoing tension and strife between Jacob's people and Esau's people, between the Israelites and the Edomites, between black and white and color. This is the breach. This is the betrayal. Have you ever been betrayed? Maybe your sibling didn't steal your portion of the wealth your parents left behind or manipulate you in a moment of vulnerability, but have you ever experienced a breach of trust? Have you ever been the victim of deception in a friendship, in your workplace, in a marriage? Have you ever been stolen from, pillaged and looted, left to fend for yourself in this cruel world? Have your children suffered as the result of it? Have your grandchildren been bursting with anger because of it? Jacob's 12 sons will follow in his footsteps, deceiving their brother Joseph and selling him into slavery. The cycle of deception continues in various forms throughout our sacred text. Deception lingers, and before you know it, centuries have passed, and the Judeans and the Edomites remain at war with one another. And this is where we meet the prophet Obadiah in his wrestling. The date of Obadiah's composition is often presumed to be sometime after the Babylonian Empire attacks Jerusalem. Hebrew Bible scholar Lores Wilkins Lawrence reminds us that Obadiah's community has been traumatized by those events. In response to that trauma, Obadiah wrote a prophecy against a foreign, non-Israelite nation, a kind of writing several biblical prophets used as a way to reassure the people of Judah that God would save them by destroying their enemies. Prophecies against foreign nations, she says, were preached to Israelite audiences more to comfort them than to condemn their neighbors. In the 21 verses we are given, the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible, the prophet captures this ongoing battle between Jacob's people and Esau's people, between the Judeans and the Edomites, generations after battling one another, generations of Edomites trying to get revenge or perhaps justice. Generations of Israelites and Judeans trying to defend a blessing that was not even originally meant for their ancestor. And yet, some might ask, well, is it the Judeans' fault that what they've built has been built on a lie? Is it the descendants of Jacob's fault that the blessing they cling to was passed down through fraudulent methods? Likewise, some folks in America might ask, is it the European descendant in America's fault that the privileges granted were achieved and made legacy through dishonesty and fraud and theft of land and bodies and refusal to acknowledge transgression? Is it? You stole the cookie from the cookie jar. Many people of European descent in this country who are fragile about their identity might respond, who, me? Couldn't be. The reality is that Judeans might not have stolen the cookies, but the lack of acknowledgement by Obadiah and others that the cookie was in fact stolen is a gross denial of the deception that occurred at the hands of Jacob in the 25th chapter of Genesis. And so the war between the two nations lingers. The Edomites are painted as vengeful, ruthless enemies who have no reason to be angry, no reason to be enraged as they wrestle with ongoing oppression. Just the same, black and brown folks in this country are painted as vengeful and ruthless as we protest for basic rights and respect of land and body, wondering if the breach will ever be repaired, wondering if the empty candy in cookie jars will ever return to fullness in our lifetime. Do you know what it feels like to be walking on soil soaked with unacknowledged transgressions? As the dampness of the earth coats the sullen soles of your feet, the soil turns to quicksand and you find yourself fighting to keep your head above a fraudulent foundation that was designed to swallow you. Do you know what it feels like to be the product of a curse lasting generations? To be reminded of that curse every time you drive by monuments of duplicity? The centuries of suffering that could have been avoided had Jacob apologized. The generational curses that would have been prevented had Jacob apologized. The intergenerational trauma that might have ceased to exist had Jacob offered reparations for his actions. This is what happens when transgressions aren't attended to. This is what becomes of us when we ignore the breach for far too long. This is what becomes of our children who inherit our transgressional behaviors, our grandchildren who grow up woven in a web of lies and deceit. Who stole my cookies and how can I get them back? They say Jacob lived in fear of his brother. When their paths were to cross many years after the act of deception, Jacob hired an army to back him. He needed some extra support. And I have to believe it was because deep down inside, Jacob knew that what he did to his brother was not just. Esau lived with a taste of revenge that burdened his soul and loitered for generations. Their relationship was never healed because there was no admittance of a breach. But there is a hope. There is a hope for healing. I have to believe it, and perhaps it's not fully captured in this story. but the stories we can write for our lives. Jacob does eventually wrestle with God, wrestle with his identity and fragility in later chapters. Some may say it's too little, too late. That reparation requires more than joining a book club, they say, and that the seeds of injustices are far too deep in the ground by this point. But I have to believe that there is yet a hope. There is a hope that lies within the possibility that the story doesn't end with the betrayal or the transgression or the deception, but that a different ending can be conceived through persistent acknowledgement of the harm done against marginalized communities in this country. But we cannot heal until we explore the breach. We cannot move forward as a community, as a church, as a city, as a country until we explore the breach. We cannot profess to love our neighbors until we explore the breach. That is the first restorative justice step, identifying and taking steps to repair harm. We must acknowledge the generational harm if we are to explore the breach. And we mustn't merely acknowledge with our voices. That's really cute. We must also acknowledge with our resources. We must understand the significance of verbal admittance and resourceful reparation. We must repair what has been broken, and it starts with us. Do you know that justice starts with us? Justice starts at home. And how fitting it is that so close to home this week, the City Council of Asheville, North Carolina, has unanimously voted to give financial reparations to Black residents by way of investments in areas where Black Americans still face discrimination and disparity in opportunity. Even closer to home, the Ministry of Outreach right here at Myers Park Baptist has granted a founding gift of $20,000 to the Restorative Justice Charlotte organization, an emerging opportunity that seeks to firmly set Charlotte on a path to addressing the persistent opportunity and wealth gaps that stem from a long history of discrimination and injustice in this city. There is a hope. And justice is not just a big philosophical concept. It's not merely something to be theorized. Apologies and admittance are difficult, especially when we're used to playing the blame game, but they are not impossible. Amends are possible. Healing is possible. The breach doesn't have to remain forever. It can be shrunk, one reparative act at a time. Beloved, I don't want my children to be asking about who stole their cookies 20 years from now. I don't want my grandchildren to be pounding the painted pavements of cities, begging for their birthright in the midst of a pandemic. I want them to have it, and I want them to have it fully, and I want them to have it wholly, and I want them to have it in peace. May it be so. Amen.